It's hard to sort of say when I started working in my field because it seems like I was so involved since college. Living in Queens in the 60s, going to Manhattan was tantamount to like going to California. It was just so exciting. And there were several of my art histories majors with me, and we started going to galleries. So when I went to graduate school, I maneuvered and got a summer internship at the Museum for African Art. Coming, out of graduate school, I had such great connections through a former classmate. I was connected with a job working in community programs at the Metropolitan Museum, and that's how I got started my career. Now, once I got to the Metropolitan Museum, I was working in community programs. The museum in the 70s was very committed to sort of like the early versions of outreach, which we might call diversity today. So part of my job was really making connections with different cultural organizations and artists in the community. And that's how I started writing, because they would say, oh, I'm having an exhibition. Would you mind, doing an essay? So almost from the beginning of my career, I was sort of really involved in writing, particularly artists of color who, didn't necessarily have the same kinds of access at that time to galleries and critics and collectors and things. The curating started in 1975. I had been at the Met for about 3 years, working in community programs. And I began to sort of think about how I could make an impact at the museum. Now, it would seem that it was a little presumptuous that, a Black young woman from Queens would presume she could impact the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But, my political tendencies, lean towards the Black Panthers, who preach the fact that you get into these situations and you make the best of it, and I was making contacts with my cohorts in different organizations. So we knew we wanted to sort of really approach the Met and sort of really open up things. So a position came open in the 20th Century Art Department. And I had become friends with the curator then, Henry Gelzeller. And I'm sure there were, not a few politics involved, but I interviewed for the job and got it. And there I was, assistant curator. And I spent 27 years, at the Met before I went on to be the director of the Studio Museum for about 5 or 6 years. And then, became a recovering curator at the Museum of Arts and Design. Now that transition was kind of interesting because I used to joke that I came from the dark side of the art world to the moral side of the art world. That was the kind of impression people had about crafts. But when you look back on my career, because of my interest in what was going on under the rubric of feminist art and under the, the rubric of different kinds of diverse art expressions, I was working with people and artists who were very interested in bringing women's work, Mexican culture, African culture, Asian culture, Native culture to the mainstream art world, either through subject matter or through techniques. 2 big exhibitions I organized while I was at the Museum of Arts and Design. The first was the Global Africa Project in 2010, and then 2014, New Territories, Laboratories for Design, Craft, and Art in Latin America. And I kind of arrived at MAD with the mandate to do a show on African design. So I looked at Holly, I said, oh yeah, you hired a Black person, so she's got to do the Black show. Okay, fine. But then I sort of realized that I could bring in Leslie King Hammond because we both have, worked in tandem, and she's really a great scholar on diasporic African art and I do the contemporary stuff. So we really sort of, put our heads together and came up with this show. And it was so interesting organizing this show in 2008 and 9 in the midst of a financial downfall. So I knew I wasn't going to be traveling to Africa, but it was fascinating to see how many venues in the States were, sort of dealing with African art. And then we just used a network that we set up that just brought us, back and forth, because I decided to basically do what we call a Black Atlantic approach, so that we could bring in the Caribbean artists in the States and artists in Africa and Europe. And then by the time I did Latin American show, it was like, sort of the zenith of the time when designers were sort of really coming to grips with the marketplace, their collaborations with traditional designers and family fabricators, and also, sort of how they can sort of really reflect, their own cultures. The challenge I had, and I was glad to have a advisory committee for that, is that design in Latin America does have a very strong theoretical and critical basis for it. The difference is that they don't have the same marketplace, So again, the timing was fortuitous because this was the moment when the Wanted Design Art Fair was really flourishing, like in New York. So I was able to sort of meet designers from Chile, Puerto Rico, from Central America. I think that with relationship to art, craft, and design, when I went to MED in 2007, I was, there was a period, that I was there, to 2015. I was really struck by the way that the whole notion of craft was changing, particularly in the fine arts, and how I had painter friends. I don't know if they were coming to sort of like really, pitch for a show. And they go, well, Lowery, painters are craftspeople. And I go, since when? I mean, you guys wouldn't even say that word, but the whole thing of making, was such a moment. You had the Makers Fair, you had President Obama declaring a day of making, and, there is a sense in which painting and sculpture is making, because you're taking a material and you're sort of making something else. But it's just that they have, since Renaissance, tried to sort of like distance themselves from craft. So all of a sudden, everybody was being, craftsperson with a capital C. So I was interested in how techniques that we would usually associate with craft were seeping into the fine arts. I was interested to see how craftspeople who had specific reputations and approach to making that may have been more monumental were seeping into the fine arts. And I was interested in how design was, including one-offs, sort of like unique, creations rather than assembly line creations that you would sort of think about with design. And then over the last 7 years, I've seen it sort of like go back and forth, it's, where, craft sort of settles down and then art painting comes back, and design is very designy, but I think in the end, we've sort of gone to a place where the interstices among those three genres is really been breached, and that the future is going to see more and more of those kinds of kinds of interactions. I think it depends, there are sort of individuals within each sector that have vested interests in sort of keeping the genres distinct. But I think, when you get young artists coming out of art school who are not adhering to the rules, you sort of are going to see a lot more sort of disappearing, like from this whole kind of thing, so that you can talk about craftsmanship. American Craft Council is really kind of like a rock, in terms of providing resources and exposure, to creatives whose work may fluctuate one way or another. That's really important. I can't think of any other medium that has quite the impact that the council has, in terms of really creatives in this way.